about 3.4, which is choosing a solving method. So every single method on this sheet, or on this particular notes, is one that you've already done, okay? So, these are the methods we've addressed so far in this class. Now technically X factor, we call it AC method, so if you want to write that, it's the same thing. Different like setup, but it's the same idea. It's like FOIL versus box method. Does the same thing, okay? Completing the square, of course we talked about that as well. And then finally is quadratic formula. Okay. So, sometimes you're going to end up with a binomial, which in this case, when it's a binomial, you want to factor out the GCF. You want to either use difference of perfect squares or simplify square root. Either method will work. So first one we're going to look at is A. So step one is we want to see if there's any values of negative 12 that are going to multiply to give me 8. So you might be thinking off the bat, 6 times 2, right? But why doesn't that work here? Very good. It has to be a negative, and those two numbers are positive. So the problem is, if I were to use two negative ones, or one negative, one positive, it just doesn't work out. Because technically you'd have to have negative 6 and positive 2, or negative 2 and positive 6, which are going to add up to 4 and negative 4 instead of 8. So this one we actually, unfortunately, can't do by regular factoring. So instead, I'm going to propose that we use completing the square method. Now, of course, like I said, quadratic formula would work here as well, but here's why I'm going to use completing the square over quadratic formula. It's going to save me some time. Here's the two things I look for in completing the square. I look to see if the b value is even, because if it's even, that means I won't end up with a fraction. And then I'll typically look to see if the a value is 1. Now, if the a value is not 1, it's not completely endgame for completing the square. If the a value is something that the b value is divisible by, it works out nicely. But if it's not, it doesn't always work out so nicely. So I'm going to use quadratic formula because the b is even, and there is no a value other than 1. So step 1 to complete the square. So complete the square is the method I'm using. We'll get to that. I'm going to bring the 12 to the other side, because remember, when you complete the square, you have to make room for that new c term that you're creating. Now, to complete the square from here, you're going to take half of whatever 8 is, which is, and then you're going to do what with it? Good, so you're going to add 16 not only to this side, but also to this is the step you guys always forget, so make sure you do it. This side is always going to factor into two identical binomials, which are 4 and 4. They're always the same. And I can rewrite this as x plus 4 to the power. And then the next step for solving for x is to do what? Square root. That's going to give me x plus 4 is equal to, plus or minus, the square root of 4 times the square root of 7. One of those simplifies, right? It just becomes 2 radical 7. And then my final step is to bring the 4 over. So I get x equals negative 4 plus or minus 2 radical 7. So to write my answer, I want to put it in squiggly brackets, okay, for my final answer. So that's my value of x, and that represents how many solutions? 2. The positive and the? Yes, very good. So does anybody have any questions about A before we move on to the next problem? All right, letter B. So for letter B, my goal is to get everything to one side so I can analyze it. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, I'll just add the 3 over, it's easier. You could do that, but then you're going to have to factor out a negative 1 automatically. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm actually going to add the 4x squared over here. And I'm going to subtract the x over here as well. I'm bringing everything to the right side instead of the left. This is going to become 0 equals 4x squared minus x minus 3. So instead of bringing everything to the left, I just went ahead and brought everything to the right. Yes, either way would work, but this way avoids me factoring out a negative 1. That's why I did it. So from here, I want to see if I can use AC method, right? Because if I can use AC method, I can save the time, and then I don't have to worry about doing quadratic formula. So to use AC method, because I see there's no GCF to factor out, I multiply these two together. Do you remember this? This gives me x squared minus x minus 12, right? And then I'm looking for factors of negative 12 that add up to what?
1.
Negative 1, which are what two factors?
3 and 4.
Good, and the 4 is the one that's negative because remember I want a negative 1, not a positive 1. Now to counteract that multiplication I did earlier, I'm going to have to divide by what I multiplied by, which was 4. That's going to give me x minus 1, and this you can bring back over if you want to. You're going to see why we don't have to on this step. We get this, okay, and we used AC method. Now from here, our goal is to actually solve for x, so we're going to set each of these equal to 0, okay? And then we're going to solve. We get x equals 1, and we get x equals negative 3/4. So I'm going to write that into my squiggly brackets as my two answers. So does anyone have any questions about that? Yes?
Why didn't we use AC for the last question?
Because it doesn't work. And another reason we wouldn't use AC on the last question is because there's no A to worry about. So AC method and regular factoring are limited. They only work in certain circumstances. So sometimes you have to use completing the square and quadratic formula, which work in all circumstances. All right. So letter C, you have two options on how to solve this. You can either do difference of squares, or you can do square root method. I'm going to do square root method. I find it to be a little quicker. And this is the terminology you would often use to abbreviate square root in math. So to solve this, I'm going to actually add 100 to both sides. That gives me x squared equals 100. I'm going to take the square root of both sides, which gives me x equals plus or minus 10. So my two answers are negative 10 and positive 10. Yes, you could leave your answer as plus or minus 10. I just want to show you some variety of how it can be written in different circumstances. Okay? Don't forget to put the plus or minus there when you take a square root. Next one here. What we can do is we want to see first if there is a GCF. And as you can see, there's unfortunately not a GCF on this one. So the next thing we would try, since the A value is not 1, is we would see if AC method works. But before we try writing it out, we want to just mentally test it out. If I were to multiply the 4 and the negative 11, what would I end up with? Negative 44. Are there any factors of negative 44 that add up to 12? No, so we can't use AC method. So what we're left with is either using quadratic formula or completing the square. Either one will work. Either one will get you the right answer. Okay? So you can kind of pick from there which one to use. But from here, I see that my A value is not 1. So it's going to be a little bit more challenging to do completing the square. But I'm actually going to do completing the square because I want to do more practice with it because I feel like you guys have quadratic formula better down than completing the square. But keep in mind you could have used it. So I'm going to use completing the square. But quad formula would also work as well. So to complete the square, step 1 is I need to get that C term out of the way. Okay? I bring it over here. Step 2 is to make my A value become 1, so I have to factor out that 4. Step 3 is to take half of this and square it. Oh, it's going to come out to be nasty. Let's not do this. I forgot this is going to become yeah, no, we're not going to do that. Sorry. You can if you want, but you guys would hate me, so we're going to just do quadratic formula. So we got negative b. It's not wrong, like you can do it, but it's just not fun. So we get minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So I just double check that I plugged everything in right before I proceed. And now in my calculator, I just type this entire thing in and let it do the math for me. That's negative 12 plus or minus square root of, I think it's 320. Let me check though. Is it 320? Okay, thank you. 320. Now, I know that 320 can be broken down into the product of 64 and 5, right? So you can kind of play around with that when you're doing it on your own. But why would I pick 64?
It's a perfect square.
Yeah, so I'm going to end up with negative 12 plus or minus 8 radical 5 all over 8, right? When I simplify. And then from here, I'm actually going to split these into the 2. So I'm going to split it into the 2 different fractions like this. And that's going to help me simplify each of those individual fractions. So to save myself a little time and room, I'm going to put the squiggly brackets and just put the answer into that once I simplify. So what is negative 12 over 8 going to simplify to? Negative 3 over 2. Plus or minus, what's going to happen with the 8's? So I'm just left with radical 5. So that's going to be my final answer for letter D. So I know I don't spend a ton of time explaining the simplifying because, yes, I do expect you guys to have that a little bit down better than the concepts. Alright, so for letter E, before I try to do any other method, my first goal always is to see if I have a GCF. And do we have a GCF on letter E?
Yeah.
What can we take out?
2.
Good. So I'm going to take out a 2. And that's going to give me this. And then now that I take out a 2, I notice I still have an A value. So I'm going to try to use the AC method and see if that works. And remember, sometimes you're going to try to use this method and you're going to say, oh, that didn't work. And it's okay. You can just go back and try another method. So to use the AC method, I'm going to multiply my A by my C. Now, a question I've been getting a lot is, why don't I multiply it by the 2? Well, the 2 is already out. You only multiply by what's actually left in front of that x squared. And that's also what you're going to divide by. So now I'm looking for factors of negative 24 that add up to negative 2, which are negative 6 and positive 4. Now I have to divide by what I multiplied by, which is 8. And these are going to simplify to become negative 3 over 4 and 1/2. So let's talk about something real quick. Now normally if I were to ask for this in a factored form, I would have you bring these denominators back over, right? But we're actually just solving for x here. So do we really need to bring the denominators back over? No, what are my two answers for x? 3/4 and what else? Negative 1/2. So if you're not factoring, you don't have to bring that denominator back over. It's not wrong, this just saves you a little bit of time. So my two answers are negative 1/2 and 3/4. So does anyone have any questions about this particular question?
Can you explain what the 2 on the outside is?
Oh, good question. About the 2 on the outside. If you were to set that 2 on the outside equal to 0, there's no x there, so you would simply get 2 equals 0, which is a false statement, right? So it would just be rejected as a null solution. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Why is the x value negative 1 over 2?
Because if you were to bring this back over, and then you were to set this equal to 0, you would subtract, and then you would divide. So I was just kind of doing that math in my head. But also keep in mind, if you're at the stage where you just have x plus or minus a number right here, it's always going to be the opposite sign when you set it equal to 0. Does that make sense? Alright, do you guys have any other questions before we move on? Yes?
What do you do with the 2?
She already asked. She's asked me that. You just set it equal to 0. It's a null solution because it doesn't. 2 can't equal 0. Okay. So as for the next one, notice that we're missing the x term, right? Does everybody see that? So that means it's a binomial, which is either square root method or factoring difference of perfect squares. So in this case, the easiest way to deal with it is to get the constant to the other side and then get x squared by itself by dividing by. Yes, so I end up with 29, x squared equal to 29. Now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. That's going to give me x equals plus or minus the square root of 29. Now unfortunately, 29 is a prime number, which means that it doesn't reduce, right? So I'm just going to leave my two answers as negative root 29 and positive root 29. And can we use the square root method?
You could just put plus or minus square root to a number.
Yes, but you have to be aware that they're two separate solutions.
Yep.
And then as for the next question, is there a GCF there?
Yeah.
No, so I'm gonna try using AC method, see if it works.
Oh.
No GCF, try AC. AC doesn't work, try completing the square or quadratic. Factors of 36 that add up to negative 12?
Negative 6.
Not negative 6 and negative 6, right? Multiply to give me a positive 36, but also add up to a negative 12. Since I used AC method, I need to divide each of these by 9. That's gonna give me x minus 2 over 3 on both of them, right?
Yep.
Now you could bring the denominators back over if you were trying to get factored form. However, I can easily see what my answer is gonna be. It's gonna be what? Positive 2/3. And that was using AC method. Alright, I'm gonna go ahead and hand out your homework and you can get started on it.
Can I go to the bathroom?
Yes.